So next up, we have Jason DeBacker, who's a professor of economics at the University of South Carolina, where he researches political economy, taxation, and firm dynamics. Jason is the co-founder and vice president of research at the Open Policy Group and a consultant for the World Bank. He'll present the Policy Simulation Library, an open source software library for public policy decision-making. And if anyone has comments or questions on Fernando's presentation, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Thanks. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, Carson. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this conference. It's funny, I kind of came to really a desire to see more openness and transparency from this angle, from the policy angle, even though I am an academic. I think I had a little bit more maybe trust in academics. That may be shifting after what I've seen the last 2 days in terms of the presentations, but it's been an enjoyable and educational conference. So I'm pleased to be here to share the work that's going on with the Policy Simulation Library, a group I've been involved with for a few years. So the Policy Simulation Library is a collection of models and data preparation routines that are useful for public policy analysis. The library was founded in 2019, and its goal is to promote the use of open and reproducible analysis of public policy. And the library kind of tries to attain that goal through really 3 different prongs. First is kind of cataloging a group of models and data preparation routines in one place. So there's kind of somewhere one can go and pull off the shelf, so to speak, something that's useful to them. And you can see that in the PSL GitHub organization, the catalog of those models, as well as on the PSL models website. Second, we try to set standards in terms of openness and reproducibility. So you can think akin to what's going on with kind of the top-down approach in some of the academy, where journals are setting standards for reproducibility and openness. We want to provide a standard for that in the analysis of public policy. And finally, like BITS has done for many years, we're trying to conduct education and outreach in order to inform those practicing public policy, as well as researchers that have policy relevant research, how to make things open, transparent, and reproducible. Okay. There are a number of projects in the Policy Simulation Library's catalog. Here are just a few, mostly selected because they've developed logos, so it looks nice on a slide. But just to kind of look at a few of these, we have in the library models that relate to tax policy, like Tax Brain and Cost of Capital Calculator, as well as Policy Engine that you'll hear about in a few minutes. We have models on monetary policy, such as the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's DSGE model, as well as more broad-based policy models, such as the Policy Change Index. And then, as I mentioned, there are also data preparation routines that are useful for creating the data that's useful in policy analysis. And so an example of that is the micro DF project that is in the Policy Simulation Library. Right now, there are 14 catalog projects in the library and 17 more what we call incubating projects. An incubating project is one where those involved in that project have expressed a willingness to make their project open, transparent, and reproducible, and they've taken steps along that route, but they are not yet satisfying all of the criteria set forth by the Policy Simulation Library in order to be cataloged. To give a sense of kind of the impression of these projects, if we look across these different projects in the library, there's over 1,350 GitHub stars on those projects and more than 760 forks of these projects. So we're seeing quite a bit of use of projects in that catalog. Again, really helps to have one place where people can go and see a number of different models useful for different aspects of policy analysis. In terms of education and outreach, the PSL is doing a few things. One is we conduct short demonstrations. We call this our Demo Day series. That happens every other week as a live video conference like this on Zoom, and the videos are then archived on YouTube. But this is a place where those who have projects in the library can share something, maybe a demonstration of how to use their project, or it could be something even more fundamental, just some basic open source tool that's useful for approaching open source models like we have in the library. We also do workshops. The next one is coming up in Washington, DC in March, where we can kind of get hands-on with policy analysts or researchers or journalists, show them how to use the model, let them kind of go home, so to speak, with the software and the knowledge in order to make use of these tools. And then, something the library encourages is for projects in the library, we like to see them holding open office hours or open meetings. And there are a number of those that are on the Policy Simulation Library's calendar. So they're public. Again, this idea of transparency from the beginning to the end of a project, right? So you can go meet the developers, those that are contributing, ask them questions, and really get a sense of what's going on in the project and make that not just something that the maintainers are doing themselves, but also just open to the broader policy community. I'd like to share a little bit about influence the PSL has had. So projects in the library have been used by policy analysts, journalists, and academics. At this point, there's been scores of articles in news periodicals, as well as public policy papers, as well as academic journals, like articles appearing in the National Tax Journal or Public Finance Review, that have used models that are in the policy simulation library. A couple of screenshots on the right-hand side here showing one of the models in the library called Tax Calculator that was used for some analysis published in the New York Times, as well as in the Washington Post. What's really interesting about those two news articles is that they didn't just take results or cite results of some researchers or of a think tank. Those journalists actually used the source code for these models along with their own data and conducted their own analysis. And then they were shared with readers of the New York Times in an interactive way, or readers of the Washington Post in an interactive way on their website. So the tools here, because they're open source, those journalists could take them and use them to build something on top of that. In this case, interactive web applications embedded in these newspapers' websites. So really an advantage of having those policy models be open source, you can relate that to many different audiences, whether they be academic or just the lay reader of the New York Times. We've also had influence, I believe, in changing norms around how policy analysis is conducted. So we've seen that with, we've had collaborations with, for instance, the US Congressional Budget Office, where there's been back and forth in terms of people in the policy simulation library who are working on models similar to what's done at the Congressional Budget Office, asking those analysts there, their input on things, as well as providing input to those at CBO. And because of those interactions, we've seen the Congressional Budget Office for the first time post their models on GitHub. One of them just went up in November, another one was just put online 2 days ago. And so we're seeing norms change with respect to how policy analysis is conducted, where it used to be closed source proprietary models within these government institutions. They're starting to open that up and share what they're doing. And we've seen the same with NGOs such as the World Bank, where they have an open source, what they call Revenue Academy. And that Revenue Academy was built directly off of interactions between members of the Policy Simulation Library and World Bank staff. So we've seen kind of influences there as well. Now, something I especially like in terms of having policy analysis be open source is it can bridge the divide here, the partisan divide that we often see with policy analysis. So open and transparent models lay bare the underlying assumptions. And as Fernando said, you can focus on the normative questions. What do you think is important? What is, in econ jargon, what is your social welfare function? And you cannot argue over what you think is in the model because that is, again, laid bare. You might argue over those assumptions and the science behind those, but what we want to do is promote a constructive dialogue and not one of, ad hominem attacks about proprietary models. And a really nice example here are policy simulation library catalog models being used in the analysis of tax policy. In this case, analysis in particular of Joe Biden's campaign's tax proposals. And I've got screenshots here from papers published by the American Enterprise Institute, a right-leaning think tank in Washington, D.C., and another analysis on the same topic by the Tax Policy Center, a left-leaning think tank in Washington, D.C. Both of these studies used, in part, the same open source model. So both of these had microeconomic and macroeconomic analysis of these tax proposals. And the macroeconomic model used, which is a PSL catalog model, was used in both of these studies, the same model. All right, so you had both of these organizations sharing the same model. Now they maybe had different assumptions going into the model, but they both used that same open source model. They both published their code to use that model along with these white papers, okay? They did happen, the AEI in particular used the open source microsimulation models while Tax Policy Center still was using their proprietary model, but they did open source the macroeconomic component of that analysis. And this is important for bridging partisan divides, but also, like I said, just shifting that discussion. Let's make it about the policy. Let's make it about the science behind the assumptions underlying the policy. Tax Policy Center, who I mentioned there with the study in 2021 using a PSL model, they were in a bit of a kind of heated debate in 2012 with their analysis of Mitt Romney's campaign's tax proposals. And this led to, I think, in my opinion, a diminishing of tax policy centers' reputation, because they're hiding behind these proprietary models, not sharing those underlying assumptions. Again, that more recent analysis where they're using open source tools like those in the policy simulation library are going to change that discussion. A little bit about our future direction here. So where are we going? So the policy simulation library wants to expand both in terms of breadth and depth. Many of us who were there at the founding of the library, like myself, have expertise in public finance. And so you'll see a number of the catalog models be in that domain, although currently other domains are covered. But we'd like to expand that to models of health policy or environmental policy and so on. We'd like to see a growing community in the library. And then as well, expand those partnerships with government researchers and analysts as we've done in the past to help, again, influence how this is done, bring that open and transparent approach to a broader group. And in particular, we have a couple focuses here in the short term. And one is a focus on helping facilitate the use of open and transparent analysis in developing countries. Here, government agencies in particular are more limited in their resources than in developed countries. And so they have really a lot to gain from both the reduction in direct software costs from open source, as well as being able to use contributions from the open source community. And then kind of a big point here, right, with transparency is that when there's low trust in your formal institutions, it's really important to bring that transparency. And that's something that this approach can bring to those developing countries where trust is oftentimes quite low. We have work underway. Members of the Policy Simulation Library, maintainers of projects there, are working in India and Malaysia as we speak to help bring these open source tools to those governments. There's also another initiative underway among members of the Policy Simulation Library to help reach subnational governments. Like developing countries, these are often more resource constrained. And there's often very complex policy rules involved in school financing, public pensions, and other aspects of subnational government policy that need that open and transparent modeling. In addition, there's often much more limited data where you have, maybe in a developed country, many national surveys to draw data from, but at the subnational level, it's very hard to get representative surveys there. And so there's going to be more need for these analysts to have data imputation or data synthesis going on in order to construct data that's useful for policy analysis at the subnational level. And when you're doing that, of course, right, there are many assumptions that need to go into those imputations and so on that are going to need to have transparency behind them in order to facilitate trust in the following analysis. Right. So again, I was really pleased to have a few minutes here at this conference with this group to be able to share what we're doing at the Policy Simulation Library. Really appreciate that. And I want to follow up. If anybody has questions or comments, you can reach me via email or on GitHub. And I'm really happy to kind of address those questions and talk about this for many more minutes than I would have here today. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jason. That was really encouraging and inspiring. If anybody has questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand or put them in the chat. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Lars's hand is up.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Ted.
Lars's hand is up.
Oh, I didn't see that. Sorry, Lars, go for it.
No problem. Jason, I guess I see now your point about how do you actually get the kind of Docker models that I talked about into confidential data, because underlying all of these open policy simulations are data assets that at some point are always confidential until you get to the point where you can actually make them public. How has your library sort of addressed that so far in terms of how far can you drill down to the underlying confidential microdata?
Lars, that's a great question. So there are, part of the standards with the library is if you are using public data that you disclose that and you share those data with your project. If you are using administrative data as you're referencing, we want to see at least some summary statistics and some documenting about how one might be able to access those data. And as I mentioned, there's a number of models in the library that use that analyze tax policy and do use proprietary data from the IRS. Haven't been using data only housed at the IRS, but rather the public use file, which can be acquired but can't be shared broadly, right? And so we've had some models that use or have developed web interfaces. Even the New York Times was doing that with the public use file. And we've with the IRS, kind of those projects have developed different measures of disclosure to make sure that those web applications don't disclose the underlying data. So kind of facilitating that. I know you've worked a lot on the kind of differential privacy and so on. I don't know the technical details of all of that. You'd have to talk to those specific projects, but there are definitely efforts that have been made to allow more broad use of those administrative data through things like restrictions on what can be disclosed on those web applications.
Yeah, just as a quick closing comment, it might be worthwhile to sort of work with, say, the OpenDP group to add layers that allow more release of such tabular data that then is an input to the models in a way that actually increases the access to those data. But we can talk about that offline.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks again, Jason.
I had some questions, and like in general, I know of this work, but see it more fleshed out is always amazing. So first of all, congratulations. My question, maybe I'll go with Jason, is that if you have any thoughts on like how to strengthen the connection with academia. I think these are knowledge products. These are important contributions, but they don't fit so well into the journal format, right? If you have any thoughts on that space.
Hey, Fernando, I was going to ask you the same because you've really tied nicely that academic research into the relevant policy parameters. But to answer kind of your question in terms of what I've seen from those in the policy simulation library community, I mean, there's a few things, right? So first is, there is this strong link between the research and policy. And to give a little bit more of my background, I'm an academic, but I have spent many years or several years in the Department of Treasury in the US. And I could see that link, right? We would go, you want to analyze what revenue is this policy going to bring in? We're going to the academic journals and looking at what are the relevant parameters here? What is the elasticity of income, the elasticity of taxable income and so on that are important determinants there. But, more specifically, getting like tools in the policy simulation library used by researchers. One of those is, trying to bridge that gap between, as you mentioned, policy is prospective. Our research is usually retrospective. And so trying to make a tool that's useful for both of those things. So you can contrast, as I mentioned, one project, the tax calculator project, a micro simulation model along the lines of what Max was showing. For the Academy, there's a tool supported by the National Bureau of Economic Research called TaxSim, which is a micro simulation model. It's all retrospective, right? Tax calculator, Max's policy engine, prospective, but doing the same kind of thing. So kind of trying to build out those tools so that you can go, both prospectively as well as back in time. And that's something that we've seen projects kind of invest a bit more in. And I think it's going to be something that's going to be important to bridge that gap between research and policy to a greater extent.
Yeah, my personal dream is that we will move a little bit more beyond the back of the envelope calculations and like the last section of a paper. It's like, okay, now I use these findings to better inform this existing open policy analysis or policy simulation library thing. And it's like that's what I would like to go. I don't know how, but that's the
well, part of it is just being open source, right? Making it available that somebody can go to GitHub, or download from Conda and install this micro simulation model, and then use that, feed into their data from their project, and say, okay, here, like you said, here's our policy implications, and we could say, okay, if this is what's happening, if this is the new elasticity, if we feed that into this model, here's what would happen to, revenue from a proposal that's being discussed currently. I think just that open nature is super important there.
Great. Let's leave it at that. And thank you again to Max and Jason and Fernando. That was really great discussion.